All right, we're ready for 1 Corinthians chapter 13 this morning, and we'll take just a moment to review. We have a shorter chapter, though there's a lot in it, and I think we'll be able to make it to the end on time. So chapter 1, what was it about? All right, having to do with division and unity that's needed, verse 10 particularly, and then focused on the wisdom of men. This chapter focused on the nature of the recipient, particularly toward the end of the chapter. Chapter 2, wisdom of men. That is, the gospel is not the wisdom of men, but the wisdom of God. Remember that one. You'll see why in a moment. This focused on the nature of the message itself. Chapters 3 and 4 go together. Chapter 3, preachers are mere ministers, and it focused on the nature of the messenger. Yes. Chapter 4, preachers are not like the philosophers. Chapter 5, immorality, the fornicator, and the lack of discipline. Remember that one. You'll see why in just a moment. Chapter 6. All right, lawsuits, going to law with the brother and fornication. Chapter 7 shifts gears. Yes, questions about marriage here, teaching on the marriage. And so here are questions that have been asked. Chapter 8. Yes, such as eating of meat that has been offered unto idols. Can we eat that? Sure, but there are times you forego that. So in light of that, chapter 9 talked about liberties not being exercised or used. Chapter 10, still dealing with that. Take heed lest you fall. Chapter 11, two subjects. All right, very good. Chapter 12, last time, started a new thought. Spiritual gifts. And so this dealt with the enumeration of spiritual gifts. All right, now we haven't done this in a while, so let's do some quickly a random review. What's chapter 2? See, when it's not in order, you don't remember it as well. Folks focuses on the message. It is not, the gospel is not men, but the wisdom of God. Chapter 7, questions on marriage. Chapter 5, immorality, discipline the fornicator. Chapter 10, very good. Chapter 3, preachers are mere ministers. Very good. All right. Let's talk about what chapters are grouped together as units of chapters. Chapters 1 through 4 go together as a unit. What's the next unit of chapters? 8 through 10. And the next unit of chapters where we are is 12 to 14. Very good. See, one of the reasons we go over these chapter titles, I hope we ingrain those in our minds so that you may be sitting and listening to a sermon or a Bible class or just reading, and someone mentions 1 Corinthians chapter 10. You say, oh yeah, that's talking about taking heed lest you fall, in light of the meat that has been offered unto idols and eating of that. And I remember that's in that unit of chapters. And so if you remember that, that'll be helpful. All right, here's where we are. We're dealing with spiritual gifts, point E under 2, questions that have been asked by the Corinthians to Paul, and they're asking about spiritual gifts, chapter 12, 13, and 14. Let's go to question 1. The main point of chapter 13, what is it? I'm sorry? The duration of the gifts. Anything else? All right, love is the answer to the problems that they're having, particularly over this matter of spiritual gifts. Anything else? Love is the more excellent way. Where do we see that phrase? Verse 31 of chapter 12. Yes, we'll come back to that in a moment. So the chapter focuses on when spiritual gifts would end. It focuses on the characteristics of love, and it focuses on the lack of love being the heart of the problem. That is, there are a number of problems that the church is having. One of which is great division over the matter of spiritual gifts. Great division, and we'll talk about some of those details here in just a second. And so the heart of chapter 13, end of 12 and 13 is the lack of love is the reason you're having problems over spiritual gifts. In consideration of each other, one thinking they're better and superior, one thinking he's inferior. And here's the characteristics of love. If you had love, you wouldn't be having these problems. And love is superior to the spiritual gifts. Why? Okay, without love, you're nothing. There's another reason. Everyone has love, and spiritual gifts are only to some. There's another reason, even at the end. These are all good reasons. I'm sorry? Never ceases. But spiritual gifts would. All right, we're going to see all of that here in just a second. All right, here's the point. Let's go back to chapter 12 and 31, and then we'll get ready to roll in through the next 13 verses here. Chapter 12, verse 31, Paul said, I show you a more excellent way. And so you say, okay, what is that more excellent way? Well, that's what chapter 13 is about. Particularly verses 1 through verse 7, as he talks about love. That is the more excellent way. I think his point is that love is superior to spiritual gifts. And he's going to give 3 reasons why that's the case. And when love is superior to spiritual gifts, then love is also superior to what they're doing now. Would you see the implication? Twofold implication. If love is superior to spiritual gifts because it endures, because of its characteristics, because without it you're nothing, you can be without prophecy, that is the gift of prophecy, and still be something, couldn't you? But you can't be without love and be something. So that's one reason. Second reason is the characteristics of love. And thirdly, the reason being in the context is that love endures, but spiritual gifts do not. So it's a more excellent way. And if it's a more excellent way, then it's more excellent also than what you're doing now, the quarreling. So notice the contrast. They're quarreling over spiritual gifts that are to cease, and yet they're lacking in love that continues. That's kind of like building a house. You're building your house, and the bricklayer puts the scaffolding up in front of the house that's only going to be there for a couple of months while he's bricking the house. But the husband and wife get in a quarrel over whether those scaffolds should be blue or should they be red, and come to the point of nearly splitting up over the scaffold. What would you say to the couple? It's not going to be there long. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to be arguing over something that's so temporary. It's not even as permanent as the house is, because it's only going to be there for a couple of months or 3 months or whatever the case may be. It's only going to be there for a while, and what you're lacking is love that's to continue after the house is built. Would you not argue that with them? That's what's going on here. They're arguing over things that are going to cease, and what they're lacking in is something that should continue on through eternity. Make sense? All right. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about the summary of the 3 chapters. This doesn't encompass everything in the chapters. Chapter 12, the enumeration. There's far more in chapter 12 than just the enumeration of gifts, but that's basically what chapter 12 is saying. Here are the various gifts. Chapter 13 deals with the duration. Is there more in chapter 13 than duration? Sure. Talks about love and the quality of love. And then chapter 14, the regulation. So I see what the gifts are, I see how long they'll last, and I see how they were to be used. Make sense? That's how that unit fits together. All right, let's go to question number 2. We've already given the answer to that, but let's see if we were listening. In what sense is love the more excellent way? All right, it's enduring. Spiritual gifts are not very good. All right, it's complete. All right. Very good. Yeah, it takes every one of these characteristics for love to work. We're going to get to those characteristics here. All right, here's what chapter 13 is about. Duration of spiritual gifts, or love is the more excellent way. So let's see how this fits in the context. Some of the commentators, and I don't know how many commentators, you may not even view any, or some of you may be viewing a dozen of those. If you did view a dozen, you probably came across this view. And that is, there are some who think 1 Corinthians 13 is an interlude. Some think that Paul is not even the author of chapter 13. He is the author of 12 and 14. And some other author has inserted chapter 13 that doesn't flow. Because they think he shifted gears. He's talking about spiritual gifts. And then suddenly he starts talking about love. And some think it's kind of an interlude where it's kind of, let's just pause for a moment, talk about love, and then let's come back to the subject. I deny any of that. It is the flow through the chapter. This is the more excellent way. And so let's see how that works. That they're obviously chapter 4, verse 6, we've talked about several times. I'm convinced, and whether you're convinced or not, don't be because I am, but you're puffed up on behalf of one against the other. I am convinced that that's pointing directly to the matter of spiritual gifts. They may have been puffed up over other things, but that had to be one. I know that was one because of chapters 12, 13, and 14. So here are the three reasons why he says love is superior. Without love, you're nothing, and then he talks about the characteristics of love. Let's talk about this first. In verses 1 through 3, he uses hyperbole. What is hyperbole? Say that louder where we can hear. Here's an English teacher who teaches this. Let's hear it.
Exaggeration for effect.
Extreme exaggeration for effect. That's what it is. It's overstatement. Does the Bible ever use hyperbole? Sure. That, and we're going to see that right here. For example, though I speak with tongue of men and of angels. The tongue of men obviously would be the language of men. The tongues would have reference to languages. We saw that in chapter 12. We see that in Acts 2. And the tongue of angels, I think, was just simply the most exalted degree or ability. Some of our friends in the charismatic realm think that the tongue of angels is some kind of unintelligible language. So here's the tongue of men, but here's the tongue of angels. What is it? Well, we don't know. We can't even understand it, but here it goes, and they start speaking in tongues, in some ecstatic jibber-jabber. I think he's using hyperbole here that, let's just suppose, since tongue is the most coveted gift, apparently, at Corinth, if I could speak in the tongue of men, and I could speak in the language, the most exalted tongue of all, the tongue of angels. It's not saying that that's even possible, but if I could, and I don't have love, then what does he say? I'm nothing. I'm nothing more than a sounding brass and a clanging cymbal. And so I'm just making sound. In other words, I'm not accomplishing anything. Now, if a person really spoke in tongues and someone could interpret, is there any good that comes from that? Sure. Could a person preach the truth and do some good, and yet he has an attitude, I'm just doing this to promote myself? Could he do some good? Philippians 1 says so. But he's doing it without love. Does it do him any good? And I think that's the point here. So if you have the gift of tongues so that you could speak in the tongues of men, and even if there is such a tongue as the tongue of angels, and you could speak in their language, their tongue, but you do it without love, as far as you're concerned, the benefit it has for you is you're just making a bunch of noise like clanging cymbals together. Make sense? All right. He gives a second illustration. What's it? If I have gift of prophecy, gift is supplied by translators. So if I could prophesy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge and have all faith. Now, we'll come back to the faith in a moment. Again, I think this is hyperbole here. That if I have prophecy, people had prophecy, but have all knowledge and understand all mysteries, that's kind of extreme, isn't it? That I have all knowledge and all mysteries, that's like the tongue. It's overstatement for effect. So suppose you could even have all knowledge, and you could understand all mysteries, and you could also have faith so that you could remove mountains. We talked about that faith last week. I don't know of an instance where one could literally move a mountain. But Jesus talked about if you have faith as much as seed, you should say to this mountain, it'll be moved, and it'll be moved. Do you know of an example where anybody said to a mountain and it be moved? It's an overstatement for emphasis. But raising the dead is just as impressive as moving a mountain, isn't it? In other words, if someone could say to Horse Mountain over here and say, be moved, and you watch it move to another county, I'd stand in awe of that. But I'd also stand in awe if they went out to the graveyard and said, rise from the dead, and they could raise anybody from the dead. That to me is just as impressive as moving mountain. That's the point. So if I had miraculous, some kind of faith, I could work miracles so that I could move mountains, and I had prophecy, and I had all knowledge, all mystery, and I don't do it with love, what's the result? Nothing. I don't think he's saying if you could prophesy, no, it's not doing any good. You could prophesy with the wrong motive, and it still does some good, but it's not doing you any good. The third illustration he gives, verse 3, the most difficult phrase in the chapter, because there's a textual issue here. If I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, let's just stop there. Suppose I made such great sacrifice that I sell everything I have and give every bit of that to the poor. Now, no one does that. Even in Acts 4, they sold much of what they had, but they didn't sell everything they had. But what if I sold everything I owned and gave every bit of it to the poor? What a sacrifice, but it's not given out of love. I'm doing it for notoriety. And then I'm nothing. The second thing is, though I give my body to be burnt, translation may say, so that I could boast. And that's a textual issue as to whether the minority or majority text is to be favored. The majority text seems to lean toward being burned. And some think, well, it's being burned because of persecution. Others think it's being burned because of you give your body as a sacrifice. I'm not sure. I'm not sure the translation of boasting is the best, though that's favored by the minority Nestle's United Bible Society text. That's a textual issue. But I think let's not miss the point. What if I gave my body in complete sacrifice? Again, a hyperbole. What if I gave my body in sacrifice, just like giving my goods, and yet it's not done in love? What's the result? It's nothing. It profits you nothing. That's the point. So without love, we're nothing. That's why love is the better way. Can I be something and not be able to speak in tongues? I hope, because I can't. Can you be something and not be able to prophesy? I hope, because I can't. And on down the line we could go. There's not a one of those spiritual gifts I have, or you have either. All right, let's go to the second section. This is where we'll spend a little time. When I say we spend a little time, these are quite easy to define. Let's define those in question number 3. So let's take these one by one. Here are the characteristics of love. If there is love, then here are the characteristics. So let's take them one by one. Question number 3, because I want us to get to the what is perfect in verse 10. So we'll have time for that here in a moment. All right, let's start with the first one. Depending on your translation, it may word it a little differently. But he says, here's the characteristic. Love suffers long. What does that mean? Patience. Patient with people. Patient with ourselves. With our brethren. With everybody. Slow to anger. Somebody who's quick to anger is not one who suffers long. That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, God's got a different timetable than we do. Very good. Kind, what does that mean?
Hospitality to a stranger would be one show of kindness, and not only kindness, it would be fulfilling God's will. It's treat someone above yourself.
All right. Helping others. It's the idea of being gentle, not harsh, sweet, not bitter. If I remember correctly, and I may not be remembering correctly, but I think that same word is used, a form of the same word, not the same word, but the form of the same word is used is it in Luke, I think, with reference to wine and having to do with whether it's bitter or not. But be that as it may, it's not bitter. You're gentle, you're not bitter. You're sweet in your disposition. It does not envy. What does that mean? All right. Bingo. Yeah, let's think about that. It means not to be jealous. You don't covet another's gifts or begrudge them of having a gift you don't have. That's envious. There apparently were some were envious of the tongue speakers. I can just prophesy. That's all I can do. But he can speak in tongues. I wished I had his gift. I feel so inferior, and I'm envious. And so love doesn't envy. Does not parade itself. What does that mean? Doesn't boast. Good. Not arrogant. Doesn't show off. I can speak in tongues. I know you wished you could too. You want to hear me speak? That's boastful. So it doesn't parade itself. All right, the next one is not puffed up. Now, these are going to overlap a good bit. What is puffed up? Arrogant. In fact, some translations say arrogant. Is it the English Standard? One of the translations says arrogant, or maybe that's the footnote. I'm sorry. New American Standard. English Standard as well. Not arrogant, not inflated with self-importance. Now, do you understand why I keep saying chapter 4, verse 6 over here points maybe here? You're puffed up one against the other. I'm just convinced of that, and I'm trying to convince you of that too. Does not behave rudely. Not unbecoming. I believe that's King James. That's good. Doesn't insist on its own way. Courteous. Cares about the feelings. If I make someone who has a different ability than I have, I don't even want to use the word less ability, but a different ability, feel like they're inferior, then I am behaving rudely. Well, I know you wished you could do what I could do. I know you wished you could speak in tongues like I can. I know you wished you could lead singing, and not all of us have that ability. That kind of attitude behaves rudely. Does not seek its own. What does that mean? Not self-centered. That's good. Not selfish. Not easily provoked. Patience. Does not easily get mad. Not irritable. You don't have a short fuse. Thinks no evil. If I mention drunkenness, you just thought about evil, didn't you? So that can't be what that's talking about. I mentioned fornication, you just thought about evil. I mentioned homosexuality, you just thought about evil. What does it mean, doesn't think evil? Doesn't mean you don't ever think about things that are evil. I'm sorry. Don't think evil of others. We don't dwell on that. We don't keep an account of evil. You know, this is the third time you've done me wrong. And I know I forgive you that time, but this is the third time. Third time that's happened. And I'm keeping an account of evil. Thinks no evil. All right? Does not rejoice in iniquity. Unrighteousness? Doesn't rejoice in that? How could we rejoice in iniquity? Yeah. Somebody that's been kind of a thorn in my flesh, and I'm glad they got exposed, and everybody knows that they're a bad character, and I rejoice that they are in their downfall. Love doesn't do that. Love does not rejoice in iniquity, doesn't delight in the sins of others, but rejoices in truth, in God's word. Rejoices in what's right, in right living and in truth. In fact, I rejoice when someone conforms to the truth, even if they have been a thorn in my flesh. All right, let's go further. Bears all things. Sounds very similar to suffering long. What does it mean, bear all things? All right, patience. Covers. All right, that's good. You bear with the faults of others. That doesn't mean we tolerate sin, but here's someone who may have commit sin and then they correct it, they commit sin, they correct it. I may have to bear with that to some degree. I may have to bear with things that have been done to me. I'm more interested in believes all things. Does that mean to be gullible? If you love people, just swallow anything that you're told. What does it mean? Give the benefit of the doubt. In fact, one translation, one of the more free, eclectic kind of translations, will use that phrase, it gives the benefit of the doubt. I'm not saying that's a good technical translation, but that's the point. He believes all things, you give the benefit of the doubt. So if there seems to be something here that could go in this direction or the evidence could point in a better favorable light, you go in the favorable light. That's what love does. You do that with your own self and you do that with your own children. Hopes all things. What does that mean? You don't give up. You believe the best. You see the best. You see potential. Perseverance. And then finally, endure all things. What does that mean? Yeah. And you don't give up and you're patient. So there is a great deal of overlapping. Now, obviously, there is a lack of love at Corinth because there is envy. There's been this puffed up. Some are easily provoked. They're not bearing all things. There's a great deal of problem at Corinth. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip that section right there. And let's go to the third section now. Let's talk about how that he mentions at the end, spiritual gifts will cease, but love continues. So let's talk about how spiritual gifts will cease. Here's verses 8 to 13 now. So we've got about 10 minutes, and I think we have time to go through this. Here's the point. Spiritual gifts are going to cease, but then he's going to point out love continues. Notice what he says at verse 8. Love that he's just talked about does what? Never fails. It endures. But spiritual gifts were going to end in the first century. And he's going to tell us that. So let's take a look right here. You might there's 3 points at verse 8. You might underline or prophecies will fail. Tongues will cease, and knowledge vanish away. Now, this is in the context of spiritual gifts. He is not saying a prophecy is going to fail in the sense that God prophesied and it's not going to come to pass. That's a reflection on God himself, isn't it? God's going to make a prophecy and it doesn't come true. Genesis or Deuteronomy 18 said if that happens, the person who prophesied is a liar, false prophet. So that make God a liar. So that's not what he's talking about. When he says knowledge will vanish away, he is not saying there's going to come a time when there is no knowledge, obviously. If so, then, and if we're at that point, then none of us know anything. So that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about are things, he's mentioned prophecies, tongues, and knowledge in chapter 12 as being spiritual gifts. Prophecies are going to come to an end. They'll fail in the sense they're no longer active. Prophets are no longer prophesying. Tongues will cease. They'll stop. Knowledge will vanish away. The term for vanish away is the same word for fail. I'm not sure why they translated it 2 different ways. But the point is, knowledge, miraculous knowledge is going to come to an end. Prophecy will come to an end, and tongues will come to an end. Now the question is, what? When? And verse 10 says it's going to take place when that which is perfect. Now, assuming we don't know what that is, we've got to figure out what that which is perfect is. Our charismatic friends think what? Second coming of Christ. He is the only perfect one. And so, and I've heard them argue that in debate. They'll talk about, yes, prophecies and all that's going to come to an end. I agree with that, but it's when that which is perfect has come, and when he comes back, then that's when they cease. So all the miraculous gifts are still going on. So let's see in the context, and what I'm about to do is to show you how I would go about proving that it doesn't refer to that, but it refers to the complete revelation. So how do I know that? It's not going to do for me to sit down with my friend I'm talking to and say, well, that's about the complete revelation. I've got to give some evidence of that. And so how do I go about showing that? Well, let's take the word perfect. Let's go to question number 5. What does the word perfect mean? It means complete. The term perfect, go to your English dictionary, can mean flawless, can mean sinless. I don't know how it's ever used that way in the New Testament. You may can find one real quick, and if you do, I'll say, okay, well, that's the exception. I haven't seen that. I'll take a look at that, but I haven't seen that yet. Or if I have, I just didn't recognize it, okay? So there may be. I have never yet seen a passage where the term perfect refers to flawlessness or sinlessness. I haven't seen that. But the term perfect, Thayer says it means brought to its end, complete, finished, wanting nothing to completeness. Vine says essentially the same thing, complete. Strong says complete. Liddell and Scott, complete, perfect. Bedag and others will say the same thing. That's what the word means. It means complete. All right? Notice the text says at verse 10, when he who is perfect, right? What does it say? When that which is perfect has come. That which is perfect is put in contrast to what? Verse 9. That which is in part. Question 4, what does that mean? If perfect means complete, it's incomplete. In part, partial. Some of your translations, and I know more of us are into the electronic Bibles, and you may have 15 translations available to you on your phone right now. If you'll do a quick scan, I think you'll find that the word impart in several translations, I believe it's Holman's, New Century maybe, I'm not sure, but there's 4 or 5 translations that use the word partial instead of the word impart. So are we seeing the picture? The word perfect means complete. In part is that which is incomplete. So it's like we have a complete pie and you cut a piece of that. Now we have that which is in part incomplete, right? It's not the complete pie anymore, all right? Now let's take this pie right here. If I only had this over here and I found out that that's come from a complete pie, and this is a cherry pie, what does that tell me about the complete pie? It's got to be apple, right? If part of that pie is cherry, what does that tell me about the whole? It's cherry. It's of the same nature, right? All right. So let's go to verse 9. This is important. If you don't understand verse 9, you'll never understand verse 10. The thing that is in part is we know in part and we prophesy in part. Partial knowledge, partial prophecy. Knowledge and prophecy refers to what? God's revelation. So in contrast, that which is complete or that which is perfect has to do with what? God's revelation. Remember the cherry pie, not cherry pie, apple pie. That don't work. That doesn't work. All right. Now you've seen this many times before. This is not original with me, and I've seen this used in debate, and it's a very effective chart. The perfect must be of the same nature as that which is in part. This would be absurd to talk about, I have a partially full wheelbarrow, and I hope in a few moments to have a full cup of coffee. That doesn't make sense, does it? I've just shifted gears. So for the text to say we have partial revelation and then we have the complete coming of Christ makes as much sense as the previous illustration. But I might say, as I'm filling the ice cream cone, I have a partially full ice cream cone, and I hope in just a moment to have a completely full ice cream cone. That's of the same nature, isn't it? All right. If we have partial revelation, then that which is perfect has to do with complete revelation. All right, our time's about gone. Let's look at two illustrations in the context. What's the illustration given in verse 11? Do you notice that the one that's the man is the same one that was a child, isn't he? It wasn't when I was a child, understood as a child, and then and behaved as a child, etc. But then the full-grown tree, wait a minute, that don't make sense. You just shifted gears, and that, I don't know how you got to the tree from the child. How did you get from partial revelation to the complete coming of Christ? The immature child to the complete or mature adult, same one. Now this one's a little harder to follow, but it's the idea of looking through a glass darkly or dimly, some translations will say. First century mirrors are not like our brilliant mirrors where you can see a complete picture of yourself. It's like looking into a polished fender of a car. Have you ever looked at yourself in a shiny fender of a car and you can see your image, but you can't really tell what color that spot is right there? Is that egg or is that potatoes that you left on you? You don't know what it is. But if you could see as if you were seeing yourself face to face, you can see clearly. So his illustration is incomplete sight versus complete sight. Make sense? He gives two illustrations of that. So when we get back to verse 10, when that which is perfect, that is, that which is complete has come, that which is incomplete will be done away. So how long would spiritual gifts last? To the day of complete revelation. And furthermore, if Acts 8 gives us any insight that spiritual gifts were imparted by the apostles' hands, when there's no apostles, there's no spiritual gifts. One final thought. Let's get verse 13. In light of all of those things, without love you're nothing, the quality of love, and then spiritual gifts are going to pass, but love continues. Now here's his conclusion to the chapter. What is it? Now abides faith, hope, and love, these three, and what's the greatest of those three? Love. Why? Or without love you're nothing, and it endures. That hope and faith come to an end at the second coming. Because once we enter into eternity, I'm not hoping anymore. And faith turns to sight. So there's no need for faith or hope in eternity, but there will be love in eternity. It abides. So even taking important things like faith, hope, and love, which one is the greatest? Well, love. Because it endures. And if it endures past faith and hope, you can rest assured it's going to endure past spiritual gifts. Make sense? All right. We're going to stop there. Chapter 14. A little more, a little harder. Regulation of spiritual gifts.